Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the first chapter in the book of Habakkuk. And Habakkuk prophesied. His prophetic ministry is generally believed to span from the year 612 BM to 589 BM. And two pivotal historical events happened there, and then one 3 years not long after. Now, for some time, Judah had been at the mercy of the empire, the race for empire in the ancient Near East, which had essentially pitted three competitors for the top prize, those being Assyria, Egypt, and Babylon. And Babylon eventually emerged triumphant, and having eliminated those two rivals in strength, the conquest of Judah was all but inevitable. So in the year 612 BM, before Messiah, the Assyrians were defeated decisively by the Chaldeans or Babylonians, and the same thing happened to the nation of Egypt in the year 605. So by 586, Judah would meet the same fate. And even though these events were seemingly beyond Habakkuk's or anyone's power to control, they remain in the control of Yahweh, and this ultimately tests our faith because it's challenging to accept the providential will, which often orchestrates scenarios and outcomes we maybe don't like, but they're all for a reason. And our Heavenly Father wants us to know His will, so if we ever have any doubts, we should have the open relationship that we see in Habakkuk. A lot of these statements and questions which he asks can be interpreted as doubtful, but doubtful is incidental to the ways of the saints. But we are not meant to live in confusion, and if we do express our doubts or questions to Elohim in faith and in broken spirit, He will satisfy the request. The challenge then lies in accepting the answer. So the opening verse reads, "The message which the prophet Habakkuk saw." So other versions translate this as vision. Vision and message are two of the theophanic manifestations. Theophany is the theological term for the appearance of divinity. And so from other translations, we gather that this was a vision. In other words, it had a visual element in it, as opposed to being strictly the voice of the Almighty. "O Yahweh, till when shall I cry, and you not hear? I cry to you violence, and you do not save." So he's petitioning someone he's petitioned before and seemingly been ignored by that source who he seeks out. Yet the problem, in more cases than not, is not that Yahweh is not speaking to us, it is that we are not listening to Him. But Habakkuk had a legitimate grievance. Now, violence was an understatement. I already explained the historical geopolitical situation in which he was in. It was a time of turmoil and violence. And where was His saving hand in all this? Habakkuk wants to know. "And why do you show me wickedness and cause me to see perversity? For ruin and violence are before me, and there is strife, and contention arises." So his surroundings are nothing praiseworthy. They're turmoil, commotion, chaos, violence, depravity, really a spiritual sickness of people all around him acting in ways they shouldn't. And this upsets a righteous, conscientious man who has a sense of righteousness and a longing for, and he's not seeing it in the world we live. And therein lies precisely the problem. If we are to look for perfect justice, we cannot find it in this world, but we can look to heaven where justice will be complete and fair. "Therefore the law ceases, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice comes out twisted." So the relationship of the righteous and why they are inflicted with what seems to be a disproportionate amount of justice is a legitimate complaint which has echoed throughout history, probably from the beginning of time. It's at the very least as old as civilization itself. And in Israel, the problem was that the wealthy were exploiting the poor against the law of Moses and then bribing the judges to pervert the law. And this ultimately constituted a violation of the covenant, one of many, and Yahweh's mercy has limits, we learn in the Old Testament. "Look among the nations and see and be amazed, for a work is being wrought in your days, which you would not believe if it were told." So around him is an amazing sight, and it pertains to nations, and it is a work being done, and it's too good to be believed almost from the surface value of this verse in isolation, but we really owe it to connect it to its successor verses in order to extract the fullest context. See, I am raising up the Castites, a bitter and hasty nation, who is going through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. The Castites is an alternate translation of the Chaldeans, which were the race which reigned supreme from Babylon, their capital city, and they are described as a bitter and hasty nation. They are motivated by an accelerated appetite for aggressive conquest, as are most territorial empires, and they are going from one end of the earth to other, seemingly in an inexorable march of conquest, subsuming all the nations which come in their way. We remember just recently they had knocked off Egypt and Assyria, and Judah is next. And to dwell in places that are not theirs. Now that is the way of empire. It is where a people from one central location spread their dominance and influence throughout a territory which they physically are not native of. They are frightening and fearsome. Their justice and their exaltation proceed from themselves. So they are frightening and fearsome. Remember, this is a vision, so he probably saw some scary spectacles in what was to come, and their justice and exaltation is not. It comes from themselves. It doesn't come from any. It certainly doesn't come from Elohim, of whom they were estranged from. Yet they were very much instruments of Elohim. And one of the challenges for a sincere believer like Habakkuk was noting that as wicked and fallen and wayward as the Jews were, they were nothing in comparison to the Babylonians. But the fact is that those who have the abundance of revelation carry the graver responsibility, and they were punished according to the terms of the covenant. They had no reason not to expect what they had already invited. Their horses shall be swifter than leopards, and more fierce than evening wolves, and their horsemen shall charge ahead, and their horsemen come from afar. They fly as the eagle, rushing to eat. So these horses are gruesome, gruesome spectacles to behold in the field of battle. They are described as swifter than leopards. That's not literally true, but the sight that he's beholding, they're going at accelerated paces. Horses are fast, not that fast. Not quite as fierce, but the people who ride them are clearly fierce. They're motivated by savage plunder and destruction and murder. And they come from afar. That means now Chaldea was about 500 miles northeast of Jerusalem. And they fly as the eagle. They didn't literally fly. They simply traveled fast, running as if they were flying, and as speedily as eagles, and they are rushing to eat. So they are motivated by an object of pursuit, and they will not stop till they get it, and they will keep going to get more. All of them come for violence. The direction of their faces is like the east wind, and they gather captives like sand. So they're motivated by and propelled by malicious motivation for violence to subjugate their enemies and to conquer their lands and to control their territory. This is the nature of empire. And they gather captives as a matter of sport. That's just saying they have numerous captives, too many to count, because they were a historical juggernaut on the path of empire. And they scoff at kings, and princes are a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every stronghold, for they pile up earth and seize it. This is saying that any competitive army is almost a laughingstock. They're not to be taken seriously, at least not measured by the awesome army, which is swallowing them up one by one after the other. And kings, armies, and strongholds are all highly, highly conquerable, and they consume them as a matter of course. And this is in the course of them piling up earth and seizing it. That means increasing their territorial grip, the size thereof. Then shall he pass on as a wind, and transgress and be guilty, and ascribe this power to his mighty one. Now, Mighty One is a translation for gods. These were more often than not depicted in idols in the ancient Near East, and Chaldea was certainly no exception. And transgress and be guilty. Now, many people who do transgress or sin do not feel guilty because they're not treated as guilty. The world teaches us that sin is okay, especially if we can get away with it. Yet there is always a retribution coming, if not necessarily in this life, then certainly and inevitably in the one that comes after. Are you not from everlasting, O Yahweh, my Elohim, my sacred one? You do not die. O Yahweh, you have appointed them for justice. O Rock, you have established them for reproof. So this is a statement opening with his attributes. He's dwelling on the nature of divinity, which is of an eternal essence. That means without beginning or without end, a timeless creature who creates and controls time. And he is completely sacred, meaning that even the presence of the slightest sin will be rejected and cannot stand in his presence. And he is immortal. He cannot die. So even though his people must suffer, and rightly so, he is still very much alive and in control. And the tools of Satan are more often than not under the jurisdiction of Elohim, who is always in control, and my trust is always in him. So he can use the wickedest people, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyria, etc., as instruments of his will to teach his chosen people and vicarious to us, posterity, a lesson of his nature and his justice. Whose eyes are too clean to see evil. You are not able to look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who act treacherously? Keep silent when the wicked devours one more righteous than he. So he's essentially accusing Yahweh of a lapse in justice. He's essentially charging him with allowing the unrighteous to prosper at the expense of the righteous, or at least treating it with benign neglect or treating it indifferently. That couldn't be further from the truth. Yahweh grieves when we grieves, and he is joyous when we are joyous. And so he takes no pleasure in the death of the wickedness, nor even in the fact of wickedness. And in fact, the sight of wickedness is something awful for him to behold, and he must judge it accordingly, and eventually and then inevitably he does right all wrongs. But he's not taking any pleasure in the fact that people are suffering, and he is not indifferent as Habakkuk imagines. And would you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping creatures that have no ruler over them? So he's essentially accusing him of debasing humanity. Now, we have the ultimate privilege as the dominant species in the food chain. Now, the life, odds are, isn't good for most of the species under us. It essentially consists of running and hiding, and if you're lucky, you won't be eaten in this life. So to be made like the fish in the sea or the insects on the ground is a debasement, if there ever was one. All of them have been pulled up with a hook, caught in his net, and gathered in his dragnet. Therefore he rejoices and exalts. So by hook or by crook, Yahweh has us. He has us one way or the other, eventually and always. And he can use hooks to as chastisement, because the positive reinforcements of blessings are going to be lost on the wayward and disobedient. So it is completely just for him to act accordingly when there is injustice in his midst and on his earth, for his presence is omnipresent throughout the earth. That is not to endorse the erroneous doctrine of pantheism, which is ultimately a separate discussion. Therefore he offers to his net, and burns incense to his dragnet, for by them is his portion fat, and his food is rich. So even though we're captured, he extends his outstretched arm to save us from ourselves and from our sin, on which we will die in, apart from the atonement and the appropriation thereof. And burns incense, that is a sacrificial ceremony done as a matter of course. One burns incense when in the altar or in the sacred precincts of the Almighty. And is he therefore to keep on emptying his net and slaying nations without sparing? Now, since the writing of this passage, the world has been chaotic commotion of a violent seesaw of a balance in power between geopolitical entities, some of which no longer exist. Now, Israel and Jerusalem does exist, but Babylon would fall to the ground, so much so that by the year 117 AD, when the Roman Emperor Trajan, who expanded the Roman territory to its peak of territorial extension, encountered a ghost town when he went to Babylon. So even though Babylon seems like the omnipotent, the one against the one power they have to be worried about, they are ultimately a footnote in history, as are every dominant geopolitical entity, and Yahweh is not impressed. Now, the things which are highly esteemed among men are abominable in the sight of Yahweh. So empires that enslaved and systematically sacrificed native populations are abominable in his sight. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.